Hey guys, welcome back to another video. Today we are going to look at the basics of how our dashboard templates are set up and a little bit of the details behind the scenes basically. So for today we're going to look at the profit and loss dashboard as an example. I'm assuming hopefully you're already a little familiar with this. Maybe you've looked at it, maybe you've copied it over to your accounts. But just a rundown, so we've got income over here broken down into different GL accounts as well as expense. So a couple of pie charts there, and then we've got monthly trends along the bottom of income, expense, and NOI. And all of this cross filters, so I can click on a specific month and then it filters these pie charts. And I can also click on a slice on one of these pie charts, and then we can look at the trends for that specific slice over those months. And then we've also got these filters along the top, so we could filter by property type, property manager, the state, property group, and then the property itself. And then for this specific dashboard, we have these filters here where we can filter by GL accounts as well. So to start, we're going to go over here into the Google Sheets that power this dashboard. So first up, we have a profit and loss Google Sheet. And so if I jump over to this profit and loss tab, we can see this is all of the data that's going into that dashboard. And we could jump into the extension, into the add-on and see what's powering this. But that's not exactly the point of this video. This part of it's pretty simple. Basically, we've just got a profit and loss report, and it's pulling all of the columns that you see right in here. So we've got the period end date, which is basically the report end date, and then the property short name, GL accounts, everything lines up to what you see in here. We've got our parameters, the start date, end date, cash flow accrual, etc. So this is all going to look familiar from what you would see in Rent Manager. And then we don't actually have it set up on this template, but typically you would set this query up or this report to refresh automatically. So maybe hourly or daily or something like that. This one's not actually refreshing, but obviously on your end, you would probably set it up to refresh. And then this tab over here is not something that we're actually using in this template, but when you copy it over, you would actually use these dates. So if I switch over to this months tab, you can see we've got two dates here. This first date has a formula of today, and then this other date is subtracting 11 months from that date. So, excuse me. So those would end up being used right over here where we input the start range and then end range. So we're running this for 12 months. And so right now we just have it hard coded, but if once you copy this over, you would actually switch this over like this, clicking that dynamic button there, and then you would select months, and then A2 would be the start, and then months sheet and B2 would be the end range. However, we have to actually leave it as April and December because our dummy data is back in the 2020, 2021 range. So that's how this report is set up. So theoretically, now we would have this profit and loss data, and it's refreshing hourly or daily or however often. And then step number two, so you might notice if we look in here, we don't really have a lot of information about the properties. If you remember on the dashboard, we had like property name, property group, the state, the property manager, things like that. And all we have here is the property short name. And that is because if we tried to pull in all of those columns for every single property, you would actually get a lot of unnecessary duplicates. So you can see already with just the property short name, we have, 9 records for just this one property, and then even more records for this one. And so the idea of pulling in the state, those are all going to be duplicates as well. So what we do instead is we have a separate sheet where we pull in the property information, and then we'll end up doing what's called a join on the dashboard to bring all of the information together into one kind of data source. So this is just going to be the profit and loss data with just this one property column. And then to get the rest of the information, we have another spreadsheet where we pull in two things. We pull in the property information. So that's going to be property ID, property name, short name, manager name, email, property type. And this is customizable, but this is just what the templates are going to use. And then we have our primary address as well. So And then we're also going to pull in the property groups. And you'll notice there's two tabs here. And the reason is because we pull in these property groups from Rent Manager, but then on our templates, we actually want there to be another property group that we kind of create out of thin air, and we call it all properties. And that one's created dynamically, and it just includes all of the properties in this list. So that can be useful just because a lot of people don't have a property group called all properties, and it's kind of a default in Rent Manager. So we want it to be a default on our dashboards as well. So we've got properties, we've got property groups, and hopefully you're starting to pick up on how these are going to end up getting linked together. So we have our short name here, and that's going to come in really useful when we want to link the property information to this profit and loss information. And then if we jump over to the property groups, we've got this property ID column, and that's going to be useful for joining the property groups to the properties information using this column over here. So don't worry too much about that. That's just kind of looking forward a little bit. So we've got our Google Sheets. Let's say that these properties and the property groups data is also refreshing hourly or daily or however often. So we've got this data, it's refreshing. The next step is we need to get it into our dashboarding platform. We need to kind of connect our dashboard platform to these Google Sheets. So what that's going to be called is data sources. And the dashboard platform we use is Looker Studio. And so the way that you connect data from Google Sheets into Looker Studio is these data sources. Okay, so as I was going back and watching this video, I realized that I kind of forgot to show one aspect of it. So the way these data sources kind of get connected to Looker Studio, let me just show you what that looks like. So there's kind of two ways to do it. Let me go to the home page. This is the home page of Looker Studio. There's two ways to do it. You can either do it when you create your dashboard. So let me just click the plus button to create a dashboard. And then you can see immediately it says, hey, let's start by adding some data to your dashboard. And there's tons of different options here, lots of things you can connect to. And in this case, we're trying to connect to Google Sheets to pull this profit and loss and properties data. So we're going to click this option, and then we're going to go and find our spreadsheet. So, whatever it is, find our spreadsheet, and then choose the sheet that we want. So profit and loss, and then maybe this right here. And then you can see we've got some options here. We could say, hey, do we want the first row as headers? Yes, we do. Do we want to include hidden and filtered cells? Yes, we do. In case someone ever goes in and is just playing around with it and filtering it, we don't want that to affect our dashboards. And then finally, you can include a specific range. We don't need to do that because it's just going to automatically detect these columns that we have here. So we'll go ahead and leave these as they are. And so theoretically now we would just go ahead and click add. What I want to point out though is if you do it this way, it's actually just going to add this data source or this data connection to only this dashboard. And it's going to pull that in and automatically just name it by the spreadsheet's name. And then if we go into resource and manage added data sources, you can see that this says it's embedded, which means it's just available in this dashboard. And so if I were to go into another dashboard and try to add a data source, we wouldn't be able to add this one in. We'd have to completely redo it just like we just did. So what you can do is you can go in there and click this button called Make Reusable, and then that will mean that you could access it in other dashboards. The other way to create a data source is you can actually just go straight here to Data Sources and then click, I guess you could just click Create and then click Data Source. And if you do this route, it'll automatically make it reusable because you're not really pulling it into a specific dashboard right now. And so you could do the same exact thing, go into here, grab this, and then it'll end up making it, you can see we can title it here, it'll make it available to you in any dashboard. So I'm not gonna actually go all the way through with that, but that's kind of how, those are the two ways to pull in the data sources. And once you've done that, it'll look something like these, and you'll be able to just see all of the columns that you're pulling in. And so Basically what we're seeing here is like a slightly different view of what we were just looking at in the Google Sheet. So in the Google Sheet, we had all of these columns, period, end date, all the way up to this is other column. And if we jump over to here, we're going to have the exact same thing. We're going to have, it's ordered alphabetically, I believe, but we're going to have all the same columns. So there's that is other. We're going to have our GL account type, etc. So everything is, those are going to be the same columns that we see over here. And then if we look over at our next data source, this is our properties. So this is going to be connecting to this sheet right here. So all of these columns should also be seen over here, which they are. So, and then finally we have property groups. So that's just going to have the 3 columns that we saw in this tab right here. So, and then you'll notice that some of these have kind of an additional column at the bottom. And this is just a default metric that gets included for each data source that you create, which is basically the number of records. So it's just counting up how many records there are. And so rather than call it record count, we call it number of properties or just properties, just because that's a little easier to understand what that means. And then same thing over here. Over here, we've left it as record count just because there isn't really an inherent meaning to how many records there are in the profit and loss data. So yeah, we've got our data sources. These are essentially just a connection to the Google Sheet. And in fact, if I click this button right here, Edit Connection, you can see that that's exactly what's going on. It's connected to Google Sheets. It's connected to that profit and loss Google Sheet or Google spreadsheet, and then specifically the profit and loss worksheet, which is this one right here. So that's the data sources. Once you have the data sources, which are the connection to the Google Sheets, then you're ready for the dashboard. So the dashboard, right now we're in view mode, which is how you would typically use these. But if I click this edit button, we get to see a little bit more about what's going on here. So you can see there's 3 Google Sheets that are getting pulled into this dashboard. We've got profit and loss here, properties, and property groups. Those are the 3 that we just looked at. Now, having those 3 data sources separate is actually not very useful. We need them to be connected by those fields that they have in common so that we can use the data as one for this whole dashboard. So that's what this is right here, this combined, it's called a blend in Looker Studio, and it basically just combines these 3 data sources into one data source. And if I click this edit button, you can see kind of what's going on here. So let me drag this up. So right here, these are the 3 data sources. This is the first one, property groups. And then we've got properties, and then we have the profit and loss data. Basically, these are going to be joined by these conditions here that we'll look at in a second. So let's actually look at the join of these 2 first. So the properties with the profit and loss data. We touched on this earlier, but these are actually going to get joined by the property short name because that's what they have in common. And so if I click on this condition, you can see that's exactly what we have inputted here. We say, hey, join these records where the short name from the properties data source equals the property short name from the profit and loss data. And then this up here, you can learn more about this, but basically what's going on is a left outer join means keep everything from the properties table, even if there's no data for that property in the profit and loss data. If we did a right outer join, it would mean keep everything from the profit and loss data, even if there's no property in the properties data source. So the reason we do a left outer join is because we want every property to show up on the list, even if there's no profit and loss data. Because obviously it would be kind of confusing if you're clicking through your properties and you realize that one of them's missing, and no one's going to know that that's because there's no profit and loss data. So we just want to show all of the properties, even if there's no profit and loss data for it. So let's close this out. We have those 2 tables connected by the short name. And then over here, we're going to connect the property groups and the properties by the property ID. And then one thing I will also mention is that we get to, right in here, we get to pull in the data, the fields basically that we're going to want on the dashboard. So for every property, we're going to pull in the property ID, the short name, the property name, the manager name, the property type, the primary address, state, and then the unit count. And this is customizable because it's just connected to that properties data source. So if I go in here, I could add something else. Maybe I want the create date, maybe I want the city, the address, the occupied unit count. I could add any of that in. So if we look at the profit and loss data, we have our GL account type, whether it's a header record, and some other ones here. Yeah, the one thing I'll mention before we close this out, this part you can skip past if you want, but it's really important that we actually don't add the property group name here. So you might be wondering, hey, we included the property name, we included all of these fields over here, why don't we have the property group name? And the reason is that the property and property group relationship is a little bit is a little bit complicated, where one property can be in multiple property groups, and a property group obviously has multiple properties in it. And so what happens is if we include the property group name, we end up getting multiple duplicates for each property, for each profit and loss record, because that one property is in multiple property groups. And so it skews up and messes up all of our profit and loss numbers on the dashboard. So it's important to not pull in that property group name, and instead what we'll end up doing is for that one property group dropdown, we are going to just use the data source. So right here, if I click on this group dropdown, you can see the data source is actually just that property group's data source right from the Google Sheet. So it's not using the combined data source. Whereas if we click on anything else, like these properties, for example, it's using that combined data source, or the property state, or the property manager, or any of these charts. These are all going to be using that combined data source. So that kind of brings us into finally these charts and how to build this dashboard. So the first thing that I always start with when I'm building these dashboards that we'll look at first is these filters. It's really important to be able to filter your data to be able to drill into what you want to look at. So the first, most important filter is going to be the properties. You want to be able to select which properties you're looking at and deselect or add back any of these. So we added this in. This is just a control is what it's called. It's a drop-down list. Actually, in this case, it's a fixed size list. And then we just select that data source, and then we select what field on that data source that it controls, which in this case, we renamed it as properties, but you'll notice if I click edit here, it says source field name. So it's the property name from the properties data. And so if I click on this, you can see what it looks like to choose any of these. So there's our profit and loss data, there's our property groups, and then right here, these are our properties. So this is the field right here, the properties name, and then it's just renamed as properties. So I don't want to get too much into that, but that's how all of these are set up. It's just a control field. This manager right here, same data source, but then we choose manager as the control field. And in this case, we added in that properties metric, just so you can kind of see for each manager how many properties they manage, which can be useful. And then we have our charts. So the way you add charts is from this menu right here. There's lots of different options. So these are a couple of pie charts or donut charts. And then down here, we have a bar chart. This is also going to use that combined data source. Our dimension, which is what it puts along the x-axis, is going to be the report end date. And then we have 3 metrics, which are these 3 series that we see. And those are going to be calculated. So if I click on the edit button, I can see the formula. So it's summing up where the amount where the GL account type is income. So that makes sense. And then expense is going to be very similar, except it's summing up the amount where the GL account type is expense. And then NOI is just going to be the difference between those two. So nothing too crazy here. You can always add filters to each of your charts, which we do here, just because we don't want to pull in any null dates. Basically what's going on there is sometimes you get some records, like if you have a property that doesn't have any profit and loss data, you end up getting nulls for some of the dates. So that just makes sure that those don't show up as basically a blank extra item here on the x-axis. So, and then each of your charts, you can also set them up to cross-filter. So we have cross-filtering turned on, and that just means if I switch over to view mode, that means that I can click on this chart and it filters the rest of the data. So that's definitely useful. But sometimes you may want to turn that off if you don't want it to be able to filter the other charts. So that's just a quick rundown of how these dashboards are built and how they work. And hopefully that helped kind of clear up any questions you might have had, as well as maybe get you excited to try to build something on your own. So